This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi. Welcome to Hubwonk, a podcast of Pioneer Institute, a think tank in Boston. The development of the COVID-19 vaccines are among the greatest technical achievements of the 21st century. With nearly 8 billion worldwide vaccine doses to date, and nearly 29 million doses administered each day, the world has fought back against the worst pandemic in 100 years. Before COVID-19, the realm of vaccine development had been the exclusive domain of large pharmaceutical firms that could both endure the long, arduous approval process and tolerate the razor-thin margin from each dose given. But the dire threat of COVID-19 demanded the world sit up and immediately invest in the promise of new vaccine technologies. This massive pandemic-induced project has created a vaccine renaissance from which new platforms can develop vaccines within days of sequencing viruses and then rapidly produce and distribute them around the world. This newly appreciated realm of science has many of its roots here in Boston and Cambridge, where an ecosystem of highly specialized scientists compete and collaborate to help combat emerging strains of COVID and bolster the world's defenses against a future unknown deadly pathogen. Could our region become destined to be the Silicon Valley for next generation vaccine technology? And will vaccine innovation be regarded as vital for global health after this pandemic has subsided? My guest today is Dr. Peter Kolchinsky, a doctor in virology, noted author, and founder and managing partner of the investment firm RA Capital Management. Dr. Kolchinsky has written extensively on the promises of pharmaceutical technologies and sees the current success of the quickly developed safe and effective COVID-19 vaccines as the culmination of decades of experimentation, investment, and tireless trial and error, which is now bearing fruit for the benefit of mankind. Dr. Kolchinsky will share with us his views on the efficacy of current vaccines and vaccine platforms, the public health considerations for effective booster design, and the promise of this technology to further establish our region as a vital center for medical innovation. When I return, I'll be joined by Dr. Peter Kolchinsky. Okay, we're back. This is Hubwonk. I'm Joe Selvaggi, and I'm now joined by Dr. Peter Kolchinsky, founder and managing partner of the investment firm RA Capital Management and author of The Great American Drug Deal. Welcome back to Hubwonk, Peter.
Thanks for having me, Joe.
Well, in our last conversations, you were wonderful. You were very informative about the science behind the then new vaccines, the mRNA vaccines. And now here we are further down the road, about a year and a half into the epidemic. And now I just looked this up, more than 7 billion vaccine doses have been administered worldwide. So we know these vaccines have been safe and effective in reducing severe disease and death. But there seems to be a growing consensus that boosters may be necessary to preserve the efficacy of the initial doses. Let's start there. Let's start with the boosters. What do you think about them? Are they necessary, and why are they necessary?
Yeah, so I thought that it would be pretty clear, very early on that this would be a virus that would stay with us forever, and that we would be boosting fairly regularly. And it didn't seem like that big a deal, to imagine a world where, like we get annual flu shots, we would eventually mix in a COVID booster with a flu shot and get an annual boost of our COVID immunity. Now, at the time, there were, some people who thought, oh, this is going to be a one and done vaccine, or the virus will somehow go away on its own. But I'm a virologist by training. You can look at the common human cold viruses. There are 4 of them, and they circulate and come back every year or two, right? So you look at that and you think, natural immunity is not going to just beat the virus to submission and make it go away. You reach an equilibrium with the virus, and it will come back, and COVID will be like a 5th virus, but it won't be like the common cold. It'll just be a much more severe infection when you get it. Even mild COVID is, not just a cold. It's more than that. So, it struck me that as long as we all get booster shots, we can at least make it, like a mild flu or something like that. that we might get occasionally. Elderly will be at greater risk. They respond more weakly to vaccines. But ultimately, if all of us get our boosters, we can help shield through herd immunity those people that might be immunocompromised or whatever. Now, flu vaccine uptake is at best 50% in the population. Older people tend to be better about getting those flu shots. But I honestly figured that COVID would be so threatening that people would be much more likely to get COVID vaccines. And I think that that's been true only sort of. Like, if you were in a place that was already open to vaccines, and maybe in the past you didn't get a flu vaccine because you were too busy and whatever, COVID made you get it. You found the time, you went in and you got it, right? But if you were in a place where maybe there was a greater hesitancy about vaccines or real reservation there, it seems to have really polarized. And I did not expect the country to be this split about the value of vaccines. Let's see whether over the coming years, those people that resist vaccines get tired of recurrent COVID infections. I mean, even mild, moderate COVID is not fun.
So I want to just, we'll move on from this. You mentioned it's sort of coming around every 2 or 3 years, and the need for boosters. Is it because the virus is changing, or is it a function of our immunity? You use the analogy of the vaccine shows our body what the bad guy looks like, so we're ready when he shows up. Which is it? Mm-hmm.
It's both. So we do see that immunity from the vaccine wanes. And that is similar to the natural immunity you would get if you had an infection. That too wanes. And you see with research that was done on common cold viruses relatively recently, because they weren't like really deeply studied before COVID. You had to like go and search for literature on common cold viruses. And there were some analyses done of blood samples that had been stored up, over many years, looking at, how common cold virus strains evolved. And what you realized was, oh yeah, we've got 4 common cold coronaviruses, but they haven't been the same strains, much like COVID has mutated, and we now have Delta, and there's Epsilon, and eventually we'll have Omega. We similarly have different strains of each of the 4. We have different variants of each of the 4 common cold coronaviruses. So those viruses come back slightly different. And so it's probably a combination of waning immunity against, a given strain after you've gotten that particular cold virus, and that virus coming back a little bit different, right? And if the virus didn't change at all, A, that would be surprising, but B, it would probably just mean that it would take longer for your immunity to wane even further before that same strain could reinfect you.
I see. So let's take a step back from talking about boosters and talk about the vaccine industry itself. You're a scientist, but you're also an investor in the pharma universe. You recently wrote in a piece that the vaccine business has long been, I think I'm quoting you directly, has been a quiet and profitable game of kings. Why is vaccine, that business, the game of kings? I assume that means it's managed by large firms rather than small firms. Explain to our listeners what that means.
Sure. So it's, I would argue, a fairly mature business where some big companies have gotten good at making large numbers of doses. It's the kind of business where generally your products are sold at lower prices, but you have to make huge volumes. And so the facilities that make these are larger. In the case of treating cancer with a pill, the amount of drug that you might make is modest enough that you can contract with various contract manufacturers, and it doesn't take as many people or as much resources or land in order to make the necessary amount of doses of that extremely high-priced, low-volume product. Vaccines, require some, heavy industrial equipment. So it makes sense that bigger companies that, have more experience with manufacturing at that scale would eventually come to dominate. If some new company comes along once in a while that has a better technology, eventually it gets acquired by one of the big companies. And so the products that people see are exclusively, sold by big pharma companies. And over the years, there have been a few of them. So it's not like there's, 10 big pharmas that are in vaccines. It's basically GSK, Sanofi, Merck, and Pfizer. And there's a couple mid-level, players. And if you think about respiratory viruses, which is what we're dealing with, as opposed to a lot of the pediatric vaccines, respiratory viruses, like flu vaccines, are really, provided primarily by Sanofi. So Sanofi has not been a name that people, have spoken about during this COVID pandemic, right? They picked a horse in this race, and it's been a slow horse. And I'm sure in hindsight, they're beating themselves up, thinking like, oh, that was the wrong horse. Pfizer, sells a couple of vaccines, but one in particular, a pneumococcal vaccine, is for a bacterial infection. It's Prevnar. It's a big selling vaccine. There are now a couple of smaller companies that are gunning for it to try to replace it. But Pfizer got into COVID in a really big way with an early deal with this company BioNTech, an mRNA company, and they just went all out to scale manufacturing, and they have one of the two dominant mRNA vaccines that are out there. Moderna is a new player. So Moderna is a small company that got big. COVID really put Moderna on the map in a really huge way. It was a fairly big, small to mid-cap biotech company. When it went public at a multi-billion-dollar valuation. If the pandemic hadn't happened, Moderna would right now be focused on cytomegalovirus. That doesn't quite roll off the tongue for most people. People would not be talking about like, oh my God, thank God there's an mRNA vaccine coming for, cytomegalovirus. It's an important virus. And it can cause birth defects and problems during pregnancy if a woman gets a CMV infection. But it's a different, kind of product. But it was always the kind of technology, Moderna knew it, and its founders knew it, that should there ever be a pandemic, it would allow a rapid response. So COVID really upended the slow, stable, sort of sleepy, but profitable world of vaccines, and made Pfizer a respiratory vaccine company, and made Moderna a new giant player. And they sucked up a ton of talent from other companies like GSK and Merck and Sanofi that really don't have sort of advanced horses in the race just yet. Merck and GSK arguably don't. Sanofi does. They're in phase 3 with a protein-based vaccine. And another company that became big, comparatively big, was Noahvax. They were able to raise a bunch of money as well and hire a lot of people. And they are just now starting to file for approval in various parts of the world. So maybe we'll see their vaccine on the market soon. So if we do, it means that you will have 3 new names in the respiratory vaccine space: Moderna, Pfizer, and Noahvax, where before, as far as the US was concerned, it was just Sanofi, right? Mm-hmm. So does this mean that all of a sudden we're going to see lots of vaccine startups and that it's a dynamic field? And the answer is not yet. The article you're referring to, I wrote about this problem that we've only just tasted. The vaccine space, that segment of the biotech industry has only just tasted startup culture, right? People left jobs that they might have been at for years and joined a new company to work on an intense, fast-paced project, and discovered what it's like to be charged with an important task and given tons of money. And will they do it again? Will they say that, mRNA was exactly the right kind of vaccine for ending the pandemic, but now that we're moving into the sort of peacetime market, the endemic market of annual booster shots, we really need to pivot to technologies that are going to be less painful and uncomfortable, don't cause chills. I mean, mRNA shots are far less comfortable than flu shots. Hey, we need to pivot to protein-based COVID vaccines. So let's flood into other names. So I mentioned one of the companies I'm on the board of, Icosavax, right? And I point out that their technologies are in some ways advanced versions of what are otherwise conventional protein-based vaccines. And a company like that can raise money in an IPO, but then it has to hire people. And so where are you going to hire them from? Right. A lot of the people that were open to moving from Sanofi already got poached by other companies, right? So you're trying to rip them out of what, like Moderna or Pfizer or Noahvax or whatever, right? So they're in the throes of scaling up vaccines and saving the world, and you have to inspire them to look ahead and realize, like, yeah, but we need your dynamic, flexible mind and skills to now work on the next thing, the next wave of vaccines. So it'll be a little while, I think, before the vaccine sector becomes dynamic and people start looking for the next cool thing that will improve upon the last one that we had. But I think it'll get there.
So you introduced a lot of interesting concepts there. One of them being that whereas vaccines might have been as you say, the realm of kings, the big players, and perhaps small marginal benefit, marginal profit, but if you produce enough of it, you can make some money on vaccines. COVID seems to have changed everything. At the very least, it made vaccines a dinner table conversation for everyone on planet Earth. Yeah. You describe a term that you describe as inverted capital dilemma. I think you touched on it in your most recent, your last answer, in that you can throw lots and lots of money at a technology, but there's only so many people in that space. I'm reminded of the .com universe. Even here in Boston, one startup was hiring from another startup. There's only so many people who can code. It takes a while to learn how to code, and so they were just stealing each other's employees. Is that what we're in the midst of right now?
Well, I would say that that's a sign of a very healthy, vibrant ecosystem. Investors have to sell something to buy something. So companies are constantly talking you into investing in them. But of course, what that also means is you got to sell something. Like, what are you going to sell? Maybe you've got a whole, bunch of money stuck in treasuries, in which case, okay, you're not selling anything that's particularly dynamic. But if you're invested in a bunch of other companies, you're trying to, pick the ones that are better. You may say, but I love all my companies. Like, you're going to have to love me a little bit more if you're going to invest in me, right? That's essentially what an entrepreneur is saying. And I would argue that, workers are capital. We even have a slide deck on the RACAP website where we try to get the kinds of people that work in biotech companies to recognize that they are themselves investors. They are investing their time and expertise, and they should come to understand what they're being paid with. Stock. How should they value stock and options? They don't think of themselves necessarily that way, not until they get later in their career. But in this slide deck, we try to teach people that might ordinarily focus on like the quality of the work, the quality of the people, and whatever, and say, yes, but in addition to all that, also understand how equity works. If somebody says, I'm going to give you 50,000 shares, you should ask them what the denominator is. 50,000 doesn't mean anything, right?
Not if there's 5 trillion shares.
That's right. But that's not common knowledge, in the labor force, right? And so the labor force is a form of capital. They flow like capital. And one of the things that I point out is, that money is merely a surrogate for people. You give a company money in order for it to turn that money into a whole team that's working on a problem. And if you can't find the labor force, if it's not dynamic, if they're hesitant to leave their job, if they don't have a taste of startup culture and what it's like to leave one company and join another, then it can be like pushing on a string. You can throw money at it, but nothing happens, right? And so, what I hope will happen here is, from a whole bunch of people having tasted what it was like to leave a pharma and join a Moderna or a BioNTech, or a Noahvax, and all of a sudden see their stock options shoot up in value. What I would hope will happen is that they start saying, I wonder if I can do that again, right? Now, does that mean that I just want them to be driven by money? No, that's never the healthiest motivation, but it helps. I would like for them to also look up and say, wow, we transformed the world with this new technology. I wonder what other new technology is out there that I could transform the world with. Let me not be afraid to make that leap. It shouldn't take a pandemic for me to leave my job and join another company. Like, let me do that proactively. I'm not scared to, take that new gig. So we don't yet have this problem, I'd say, of startups poaching startups. We're struggling, I think, in the vaccine space to just get people that are at really big companies to join a startup. But it's starting, and COVID helped prime the pump.
So let's start again with before times, before the COVID vaccine, we had big players producing vaccines. Now COVID sort of shook the world up, and people are interested and curious. You talked about mRNA vaccines, which seem to be somewhat revolutionary. I don't know if you'd agree with that characterization.
Sure, absolutely.
What are the main categories? You even differentiated viruses that address respiratory infections. If it's too many to enumerate, at a high level, how many different sort of flavors of vaccines, and can a firm that does mRNA also do a different kind of attenuated virus? Or I'm throwing out terms.
Yeah. So if you should think of each virus as a particular problem, and you should think of the mRNA or virus-like particle or recombinant protein or adenoviral vectors. Those are tools, right? And so a company that has a particular tool, adenoviral vector, can apply its tool like a wrench to a whole range of problems. mRNA is a particular tool, call it a pair of pliers, and it's being applied to a whole bunch of different viruses. Now, it can't do all kinds of pathogens. Specifically the kinds of pathogens it can tackle are the ones that are covered in proteins. And so mRNA can encode the sequence, the recipe for a particular protein, bacterial, possibly viral, certainly, and train the immune system to recognize that protein. But there are some bacteria that are covered in sugar molecules, particular types of sugar molecules, not literally table sugar, it's more complex sugars. And that's the kind of vaccine that Pfizer sells for pneumococcal infections. It's called Prevnar. mRNA would not be able to do that, right? So I would say mRNA is incredibly versatile technology, and Moderna is already showing that it's, applying it to a whole lot of different viruses. The one limitation that has emerged during COVID is it's what's called highly reactogenic. It's immunogenic, meaning it generates an immune response, but it's also reactogenic, which I guess you could think of as it generates a reaction from you where you're like, oh God, that hurt. Or I'm really fatigued, or I'm suffering from the chills. Or
I've got 36 hours of flu-like symptoms. I have both on the second and the booster. I'm a Pfizer person, and it cost me 2 weekends. It's a fair trade, but it was tough.
Well, and that's the thing, right? If COVID actually does, pose a real risk to you, then it's better to lose a weekend for sure, or high likelihood of losing a weekend than, losing your life, or even being hospitalized, or suffering even moderate COVID, for like 2 weeks or something like that. But if you're younger and you look at this vaccine and you're like, this is going to cost me a weekend, high probability, or I take my chances and odds are I'll be asymptomatic, maybe mildly symptomatic, and a tiny, tiny chance that it's, moderate. I can see how somebody might say, you know what, I'm going to skip that booster with its high likelihood of knocking me out for the weekend and take my slim chances of, suffering, something I'll regret. So it's really important to make sure that people don't feel like they have to trade very much off at all to get the protection of a vaccine. And so there are more conventional protein-based vaccines. So if you think of mRNA as the instructions for how to make a picture of the bad guy, then protein is basically like injecting the Polaroid of the bad guy directly in you. Like no instructions needed. This is what the guy looks like, right? And so that protein-based vaccines, have been used for years and a lot of different vaccines, and they're fairly conventional. They are a little slower, or a lot slower in some cases, to manufacture and scale up. So they weren't great for rapid pandemic response. But given that this virus is frankly not mutating that rapidly, you've got plenty of lead time to make a protein-based vaccine, for just annual boosting. And since flu vaccines are protein-based, you can combine protein with protein and just create a combination vaccine, that'll cover COVID and flu. So I expect that eventually we're going to have combination COVID, flu, and possibly other viruses mixed in, respiratory panel vaccines, as they're called. So there's pediatric panels where people get a Tdap, tetanus, diphtheria, and pertussis. They get that typically as adults once every 10 years. If you have a baby, they recommend that you get a booster. Tell the grandparents, get a Tdap booster. And so, we actually have a lot of examples of vaccines being bundled, so that they can just be more conveniently administered. There are attenuated virus vaccines as well. These would be versions of the bad guy. It's basically like taking a clone of the bad guy, kneecapping him and injecting him into your body and being like, he's going to try and pull off some muggings in your body, but it'll be really minor. Your immune system will get a really good look at what the actual bad guy looks like. The trouble is that attenuated viral vaccines, if you're immunocompromised, even a bad guy who's been kneecapped can really do a number on you. Right. And so it's a risk benefit that is a little bit harder to thread. And mRNA doesn't come with that baggage. Turns out mRNA comes with something else, this rare myocarditis risk that is emerging. And younger males in particular, have to be mindful of it. It's still rare. And even if you get it, it can pass. It's not, the worst thing in the world, but very, 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 very rarely, yes, it could be extremely serious. And of course, the public reacts to that, without a sense of the frequency of the risk, just the magnitude of it. And there's a sense of well, you told me vaccines are safe. It's you know what?
We have to go back to let's offer everybody the denominator. To bring
that's
back
right. And it's technically you take risks every day. I mean, you eat McDonald's and you cross the road. I mean, but that's not a winning argument. Trying to tell people they're not doing the math right isn't quite right. Indeed, do we need to be stimulating people's immune systems that hard in order to boost them? Protein-based vaccines are less reactogenic. They don't rev you up as much. They boost what needs boosting. They remind your internal, surveillance mechanisms. Remember, this is what the bad guy looks like, but they don't trigger military exercises, and war games the way mRNA seems to.
So to get down to brass tacks, when we're talking about COVID, at a broad level, you're saying, look, we shouldn't be surprised that we again lose a weekend to get the shot, and given that cost and well-known cost, the average man on the street may decide to skip it and therefore becomes effectively less effective as a vaccine. So moving forward, we have to come up with alternatives. So your expectation is that boosters in the future, I shouldn't plan which weekend I want to lose in 2022. Rather, I'll be getting a protein-based vaccine that will be effective as it needs to be. And I will want to get it because it won't cost me a weekend.
That's the hope, certainly. We got to keep working on that, and it is extremely important. That we've gone from a phase where simply getting protection by any means was the most important thing. And now we've got to refine the product to where it's the kind of thing that a lot of people are going to want and trust, during peacetime, when there isn't quite that urgency of hit me with whatever, I'm terrified of COVID. I think that it's possible that maybe somehow mRNA will be engineered to be less reactogenic. for example, kids now, we just got an approval of the Pfizer mRNA shot for kids aged 5 to 11. And when you look at the tolerability profile of that, it's better. They're also giving a much lower dose to kids. And so your kids are getting some protection and it's better tolerated. Thank God, because if you've ever taken a kid to get a flu shot, that is a really well-tolerated vaccine. And the idea of taking kids for a repeat dose of, mRNA that felt like what I got or what you got, Joe, like you will never get them to go with you. They'll kick and scream. You're gonna have to do things to your kid that, you'll lose sleep over, right? So we definitely need vaccines that kids are gonna, resist less, and bundle it with flu, because I only want to hit them with one needle.
Right. So let's talk about the sort of how you characterize the different types of vaccines and boosters. If I hear you right, the mRNA type of vaccines are really effective at, let's say, I don't call them shock troops, but fast reaction troops that can be designed relatively quickly. A novel, COVID, God forbid, COVID-21 comes down the line. Our first reaction is going to look into the bag, the tools called mRNA, and develop something quickly. It may have some side effects, but we can get it fast. And then over time, perhaps protein-oriented or protein-based vaccines will be developed for boosters. Am I reading that right? Or does it matter what COVID-21 looks like?
If you think of mRNA as being like in instructions, then I would say that, mRNA is basically like a bunch of like keychain drives, thumb drives that you quickly manufacture, and you upload the code for the image of the bad guy, and you stick them into everybody and upload the instructions, as opposed to having a bunch of photographic printers, that you have to run and print out, pictures, and then you have to inject them into people's bodies, right? So you're sort of kind of skipping a step. And so in theory, you can make mRNA doses maybe a few months faster than you could make a protein-based vaccine if you're starting with 2 fully operational facilities and you're given the sequence for the bad guy at the same time. I'd say that this time around, it was not just a couple month difference. The companies that should have been fast were slow. The companies that were fast were starting not from a fully operational facility, but from near bankruptcy, like Noahvax. So they went through a lot of growing pains, having to regrow from near bankruptcy. If you had caught that company a couple of years earlier, they would have owned their own manufacturing facility that was focused on making flu, and they would have been able to react more quickly. But they had just sold off that facility essentially to stave off bankruptcy, and then COVID hits, and they're forced to work purely through contract manufacturers. So bad luck for them, and that's going to cause delays. Companies like GSK just decided not to get into the game of making vaccines. They merely made one of their adjuvants, which is an immune stimulator that you sprinkle into a vaccine to rev up the immune system. They made it available to other people, but otherwise they didn't bother to make any antigens of their own. I'd be curious why, but the person who led GSK's vaccine efforts for many, many years, Moncef Slaoui, he ran Operation Warp Speed, sorry. So he ran that. So at least you sort of had like the GSK vaccine leader running America's vaccine sort of accelerator program, right? Indirect GSK contribution. Merck is a vaccine company. They bet on a couple of less common, unusual vaccines. If anybody actually really wants to get into the weeds of this is after all called Hubwonk. So I take it that
we're going to get wonky. All right.
All your audience members just love getting in the weeds of stuff. But if you go on racap.com, you'll see we've got a COVID section. And in the COVID section, we have some high resolution mind maps of tons of different technologies. And it may still be that we have a version on there that shows like a whole bunch of decommissioned COVID vaccine programs. And you'll see way back when, like what we said about them. I wonder if we even have old versions of those maps up where we point out like, this is probably not going to work, right? So And that's not fair. You can say that about just about any biotech thing, like it's probably not going to work. But
right.
A lot of these things were not surprises to us when they turned out not to work. Indeed, they didn't. I would have liked to see some of the giants really put their expertise behind more, traditional technologies, just protein-based. And some of them got, I feel, distracted with attenuated viruses and unusual viral vectors. I feel like we'll be better for the next pandemic. People will realize like, yep, let's do mRNA. And maybe by that point, we will have validated something like virus-like particles, VLP, protein-based vaccines. And those possibly can be made super quickly, like using, a Polaroid camera that like spits out an image really quickly. So they might be a little slower than mRNA, but maybe on the scale of like 6 weeks slower, not 6 months slower.
So I want to, we're talking about COVID-19. This is the problem we know, and this is the epidemic we're in the middle of right now, or hopefully on the tail end of right now. But perhaps I've got a vaccine on the brain. In reading and preparing for our conversation, it amazes me the power of vaccines that become so prominent. In my view, I'd rather get a vaccine to prevent a disease than a fantastic cure once I have the disease. One that popped up in my research was, trials of, if you can believe, a triple negative breast cancer vaccine, not just to treat breast cancer, but to prevent women from getting breast cancer. Share with our listeners some of the most exciting, let's say, breakthroughs or the potential, broadly speaking, of vaccines. Can a vaccine in theory cure anything?
All right. So the word vaccine is the same between cancer vaccine and like COVID vaccine. But what this technology is being asked to do is so radically different that it sparks a lot of false hope. Basically, a vaccine triggers the immune system to learn to recognize something, right? Mm-hmm. Well, the immune system is already like looking out for pathogens, and we've evolved for many years, millions of years, right? Animals have got immune systems. When there's something that is clearly not you, a virus entering your body, it's not hard to be like, that is clearly not me, let's attack it. But cancer, that's you. That's like a bad you, right? Like the dark, a clone of you has gone to the dark side in some subtle ways. It looks very much like you, but it's a certain like squint of the eye. You're like, I don't think that's, a good version of me. And the immune system has a hard time recognizing that. And what's worse is that these, cells that have gone to the dark side, they've got some mad skills at evading the immune system. In fact, there's skills that viruses have learned to co-opt and do something similar. They hide from the immune system. The very fact that the cancer even emerged suggests your immune system failed to see it. And so, you don't have that bar to jump over in the case of COVID. Like your immune system doesn't know what COVID looks like because it hasn't seen it yet. The moment you show it what COVID looks like, your immune system's like, I got it from here, I'm good. But in the case of cancer, your immune system has seen it and now it can no longer do anything about it. So the idea of treating somebody with cancer, with a cancer vaccine that will get the immune system to like do what it's clearly been bad at, is a really high hurdle. Companies are working on it. There were glimmers of some hope. We've got a cancer vaccine for prostate cancer called Provenge that looks like it tacks on 4 months of extra life. That really sparked interest in cancer vaccines. But we've since seen tons of vaccines fail to live up to the expectations people had, all kinds, mRNA vaccines, you name it. So the idea of showing the immune system a picture of what the cancer looks like and being like, no, how about this picture? What about this? What about if I use this like really cool Instagram filter? Like now will it work? Like we're trying all sorts of stuff and we just can't get the immune system to simply react to that picture and go kill the bad guy. We've got other technologies. We've got antibody drug conjugates, for example, which is like, all right, immune system, you cannot seem to manufacture an antibody to go after the cancer. we'll just do it for you. We've got these giant reactors. We are making a monoclonal antibody. We're attaching a toxic payload to it, and we're going to send that into the body like a homing missile, and it will simply find those cancers and it will, kill them with the toxin, right? So, that's a little bit like the monoclonal antibodies that Regeneron and Eli Lilly have made for COVID. If you can't seem to mount a strong immune response to a vaccine yourself because you're immune compromised, all right, well, we got you. We basically did that whole immune reaction to a vaccine thing outside the body in a big vat, and we'll just stick the end product in you, the antibody, right? So in a sense, that's what we've been. We can't get the immune system. It's almost like everybody's immune compromised when it comes to cancer, and we have to just inject the antibodies themselves, right? And the trouble is that these cancers, they mutate, and they find ways of evading the antibodies. And what you hope is that you can somehow get the immune system to kick in and recognize a lot of different features of the cancer and basically make it so that the cancer can't change its appearance that much because the immune system is just all over it. But again, maybe the immune system once was able to do that. The very fact that the cancer emerged suggests it lost the ability to do it.
So our conversation is about the exciting, potential for vaccines to transform medicine in some way. And you said perhaps maybe the limiting constraint is talent or expertise or just numbers of people who are good in this space.
Enough, not in the cancer vaccine space. That has not been a game of kings. That has been, basically this fairly large mind map that we've got of lots of companies. At this point, probably 60 companies at least over the history of the industry that have tried to develop cancer vaccines of one kind or another. And very rarely have you seen big companies venture into it because with the exception of this one prostate cancer vaccine, nothing has worked. And so the pharma companies look at that and be like, I don't think we're missing out on anything here. Like, we're good.
Right.
We'll catch you if one of you has a breakthrough. So it has been this zone, this graveyard where occasionally somebody's like, no, I think I can do this. Like, how about this? And, if they find some investors that are like, yeah, I think this is the one, fine. They're able to run the study and then they fail, right? And it's just failure and failure and failure. That makes it so exciting.
For someone like you, because if you get it right, if you come up, you get your lottery ticket, right?
I mean, it's not even so much, from the investment standpoint, it's just like you root for the underdog, like the fact that we had that one prostate cancer vaccine makes you think like, but it's possible, right? And you kind of hope that someday we have a breakthrough. It's kind of like Alzheimer's, right? Aduhelm is in the news, the Biogen Alzheimer's.
So we did a show on Aduhelm, yeah.
Yeah, and indeed, we do need some bigger studies to convincingly prove whether or not this drug and other drugs like it work. But there's a growing preponderance of evidence that says they're doing something, and it's so hard to convey to somebody that hasn't lived with this space for 20 years, and that's not even that long a time. There are people who've lived with this area for a lot longer than that. For decades, there have been people that said, I know, let's just target this protein called A beta. That's the key to treating Alzheimer's. And it's just been failure after failure after failure. I mean, it was like this smug thing. You can say like, oh man, they're so dumb. I can't believe they're funding yet another trial. Like, this is the problem with biotech. People waste money doing stuff that'll never work. I'm so much smarter than them. If it were up to me, I'd never run trials in that. And then, God damn it, a trial works. Like, what? And all of a sudden you have to realize, you recognize like, oh my God, what if these diehards that kept at it, that were laughed at, that everybody talked about them as like they're crazy. What if they were right? And then you feel bad, like, geez, I doubted them, and they were right all along. They nurtured this flame of possibility. They didn't give up in the face of so much adversity. They were like, no, I really think that trial was flawed. That antibody wasn't quite right. I still think this could work. And you get this signal that maybe they've been right. That's so exciting, right? I'm not into baseball, but it would be like watching one of the worst baseball teams in the league make it, to the World Series.
Well, we were here in 2004, weren't we?
And see, I don't know what that means.
All right. Well,
but yeah, I guess
only
the Red Sox started
86
there.
years. That's all.
Yes, you're right. You're right. Sorry, I do know that. My dad's a diehard Red Sox fan. So yes, I just assumed the Red Sox are like a winning team, but it wasn't always so.
No.
So, when you get that signal, all it is your team, the Red Sox, they made it to the World Series. That's where Aduhelm is, the World Series, but they haven't won. Mm-hmm. The point is, it's amazing that they even got there. The fact that the FDA acknowledged after so many failures, they're like, we think there's something there. And we think that it's so special in Alzheimer's of all fields, like a place where it's so hard to inspire anyone to believe that there's any hope, that, you know what, let's actually kick this one into the market. Let's let patients, get it if they want. Well, the trouble is, until you've won the World Series, insurance plans, doctors, and patients don't really feel like taking it. And that's what you're discovering, that, it's not enough to have made it into the Alzheimer's World Series. We're all waiting to see who actually wins. But it's quite something, because essentially Alzheimer's has been a game where, amazingly, every single team fails the playoffs. I don't know how that's possible, but if you could imagine everybody losing the playoffs and nobody getting to the World Series, that's what it's been like for decades.
In that space. Right? So for the benefit of our listeners, I'm going to shift this conversation just to, local or current events. We're in Boston, / Cambridge, Athens of America. There's lots of smart people working in this space. You only have to go across the Longfellow. I actually, walk past the head of Moderna every morning when he's on his way to work. I'm coming back from my run. So this is real. It's, it's front page right here.
It's fun for me.
That's right. He's on the Hill. What can, let's say, policymakers in listening to this conversation who are inspired by your inspiration, they want to make, let's say, Boston, Cambridge into the Silicon Valley of, if not pharma, perhaps this new world of vaccines. What could policymakers do to perhaps get more teams trying to get into the World Series and ultimately solve these what seem like intractable problems of medicine that eventually we'll figure it out?
So it's interesting, right? You have policymakers that think locally about their local economic interests, and those would be our mayors and our governors, and local representatives, and they are very pro biotech. They understand that, biotech and even pharma, like these are gleaming jewels of creativity in the Boston area, in Cambridge area. And then you have national leaders, and, we have some local, people that in theory understand that, Boston's awesome at this, and it's an important industry, and should be proud of it. But for the most part, all of the Democrats that Massachusetts has sent to Congress have just voted for something that is highly toxic. There's one exceptional freshman, Democratic member in the House, Jake Auchincloss. He actually comes from a healthcare biotech family, and I've never met anybody like him who truly cares to understand how investment in R&D works, and wants to understand this industry and which incentives would cause what behavior. So I would basically say that we have one member of Congress, from what I can tell, that is really trying to achieve reforms that will preserve innovation, solve affordability, from Massachusetts. That's Jake Auchincloss. And then you've got one over from the San Diego area, Scott Peters, that has done a lot of work, but that's San Diego. But I'm kind of surprised. I would have thought that Massachusetts would have sent, Democrats that would have actually conveyed the value of innovation. They would have hammered pharma for milking old drugs for profits. They would have been like, dude, that's rent seeking. That's no good. We're going to shut that down. We're going to make sure all old drugs go generic without undue delay and save money. And we're going to, apply those savings towards lowering out-of-pocket costs for people so they can properly afford medicine. But, we've got local people that should be proud of, the kind of work that we do around here, that went to Congress and vociferously advocated for, the kinds of price control measures that would shut all this down. So it's a little bit demoralizing, right? I don't know how you guys do politics on your podcast, Joe, but
we're not nonpartisan. And I'm not going to start now, but I have a lot to say.
The thing is, it's a really cool question, and so I would suggest that you consider talking to Jake Auchincloss, just to get a sense for what is it like, for somebody who's homegrown, comes from kind of a biotech healthcare family, is on the inside of the Democratic Party, is local, and is trying to advocate for preserving innovation within a party that otherwise just keeps banging the drum on how evil pharma is.
Well, that's good news. All right, we're getting close to the time of end of our time together. So I want to give our listeners a chance to read more about your work, either your thought pieces or some of the cool RA Capital slide decks that you offer to make everyone a little smarter. I'm sure there's some STEM graduates who want to get into this field, perhaps or perhaps
there's two places people can go. So there's two places people can go, maybe three, but they can go to racap.com and go under the knowledge section, and they will find some pretty detailed and insightful slide decks there. And they can go to the website of a nonprofit organization that I was involved in starting, called No Patient Left Behind. So nopatientleftbehind.org. And that organization does advocate for constructive healthcare reforms, like solving affordability by lowering out-of-pocket costs, and ensuring that society gets value from all the branded drugs that it pays for, by making sure that they all go generic without undue delay. But, for an appropriate length of time, which I would say is, the typical 13, 14 years that drugs are branded, leave market-based pricing alone, right? So I explain market-based pricing in a slide deck. We end up creating an animation that you can find linked on that website. It's basically like a 3-minute animation version of my book. Because, Joe, nobody reads books. So
we have podcasts.
You write a book in order to have the credibility to launch a slide deck, and then maybe turn that slide deck into a 3-minute animation, and just maybe then people will watch it and be like, oh, okay, I sort of get your idea. So I would invite people to go to nopatientleftbehind.org, really, and that's where they'll find sets of slide deck explainers and animations that, honestly, if you really want to understand about healthcare, drugs, drug pricing, how investing works, how investors make investment decisions, like this will be like an MBA course, like, laid it all out there. And if only, our policymakers in Washington.
Right. We'll send it to our delegation. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, or maybe we just need all voters to go through some slide decks. I don't know.
Right. We need to say, well, that's great advice. I hope we've helped make our listeners a little bit smarter, and I think you helped inspire them to get excited about this space and the potential for medicine. And there's people out there like you swinging for the fences and hoping to win the World Series. So thank you very much for your time today, Peter. I think you've informed but also inspired our listeners today.
Well, thanks for making this conversation possible, Joe, and I look forward to checking in with you again in a year. Hopefully we're not talking about the Omega variant.
I do too. Thank you very much, Peter. This has been another episode of Hubwonk, a podcast of Pioneer Institute, a think tank in Boston. If you enjoyed today's episode, there are several ways to support the show. It would be easier for you and better for us if you subscribe to Hubwonk on your iTunes podcatcher. If you'd like to help us find and reach more listeners, It would help us if you would offer a 5-star rating or a favorable review. We're always grateful if you want to share Hubwonk with friends. If you have ideas or comments or suggestions for me for future episode topics, you're welcome to reach out to me at hubwonk@pioneerinstitute.org. Please join me next week for a new episode of Hubwonk.